What's going on, people? We are Tottenham TV here, and we have got a special guest to bring to you today. A Tottenham exclusive straight from The Athletic. Goes by the name of Charlie Eccleshare. I'm sure you would have seen his name banded around all throughout Spurs Twitter and social media, giving us all the news and gossip and exclusives. So if you want to get your questions in, do put them in the live chat and we'll get to them as and when. But let's introduce Charlie Eccleshare from The Athletic.
Let's bring him on.
How's it going, Charlie? How you doing? Welcome to the channel, my friend.
I'm good, yeah. How are you?
Yeah, I mean, I say good, but, you know, the constant revolving doors at Tottenham Hotspur doing my head in a little bit, as it probably is for you. But at least it gives us something to talk about, eh, Charlie?
Yeah, it's never dull, which when you're covering a club is generally a positive thing. There are some times when I'm like, oh, you know, one quiet day would be nice. But, yeah, never going to happen. So let's make peace with that and just embrace it.
Yeah, absolutely. And no, let's just get straight into it, because Antonio Conte is obviously the name on everyone's lips at the moment. When we got him through the door, everyone was so excited. Another elite manager through the door. It's turned sour once again, as it usually does with Antonio Conte. But if you cast your mind back to maybe the back end of last season, it seemed like all the players were on board. We were playing good football. We were scoring a lot of goals, catapulted ourselves into that Champions League football. But what's happened since then, and why does it seem like the players are not on board with him anymore? What's changed from maybe the back end of last season till now?
Yeah, it is really interesting, because when I look back on that May 2022 period, and especially you'll remember obviously the 3-0 win over Arsenal, which it didn't guarantee top four, but it was pretty crucial in doing so, and coupled with Arsenal then losing to Newcastle, Spurs got fourth. And at that time, that felt so critical, and you know the noises were that Spurs would be able to kick on, while Arsenal would be consigned to the wilderness for forevermore. Obviously, they've gone in really different directions since. I've been asking myself that question a lot. Why have Spurs not kicked on? I guess and I did a big piece on this with Jack Pitbrook last week, kind of looking at what was going on behind the scenes, etc. But to go chronologically, I mean, the summer was always going to be important, and what's weird is that at the time it felt like quite a positive summer. Spurs spent quite a lot of money, 60 million on Richarlison, come in as a backup, felt like a pretty big boy move. Basuma came in. He's a player I've always thought is fantastic, and I thought would be a really good player for Spurs. I remember he was amazing for Brighton against them in a game Brighton won in April of last year. And obviously then there was the Jed Spence thing, and Conte telling us in Korea that it was a club signing. And I think that was when you saw maybe the fault lines starting to show a little bit. But I've been really surprised. The performance levels have just been so underwhelming. And I think, part of that is the slight inflexibility tactics-wise on Conte's part. The fact that he would pretty much always play the same team. There wasn't a huge amount of rotation. And I think players just started to get a little bit tired of it. The fact that it was always the same thing, there wasn't much variety, and suddenly all the kind of work they were doing on the training pitch, which had gone down really well in Conte's first season, becomes a little bit tedious when it's the same thing without a huge amount of variety. And and then there are lots of factors. The Spurs have been unlucky with injuries. Obviously, Conte's had a lot of things to deal with in his personal life. There was the World Cup. I think it's just all combined to make this sort of quite meh season where they just have, I don't know, it's never caught fire. Even the Champions League run felt really underwhelming somehow. I remember thinking, I think it was the Sporting Lisbon game at home, and just looking around and being like, top four Champions League was meant to be this panacea. It was meant to be, once you're in the top four, everything's great. And I was looking around, I was like, is anyone actually really enjoying themselves here? It felt pretty miserable. It's kind of been the theme of the season. Ditto that Milan second leg, Champions League knockout football. That's what this amazing stadium was built for. And it was all just really underwhelming. And then obviously the more things sort of started to go against Conte, the more he lashed out, and this sort of vicious cycle developed. And obviously that culminated in that pretty extraordinary press conference that we saw at St Mary's a few weeks ago. And by that point, his position was untenable, and they just had to work out all the terms of his exit. But yeah, it still remains. Speaking to people about it, a word I've heard a lot is waste. It just feels like a bit of a waste because it did feel at the end of last season like maybe something had changed and that Spurs could kick on and would kick on, and they've actually regressed. And yeah, I think that'll be a big source of regret for everyone at the club.
Yeah, and talking about, I read the article you and Jack wrote about the downfall of the Conte tenure, and obviously, as my brother mentioned, the players started to complain about the repetitiveness of the training and the lack of variation. But is that maybe a problem, what Conte is pointing out when it comes to talking about the culture of the club and maybe the culture of the mentality of the players? When he talks because we've heard these kind of complaints from these players. This isn't the first time we've heard maybe these kind of leaks to publications about complaints about training methods. We heard it at the back end of Pochettino's era. We've heard it in Jose Mourinho's era as well. Now we're hearing under Conte about these complaints. So when we start to hear these complaints, do you think it's more on the manager to kind of, obviously it's a manager's job to motivate, but is it on the manager to kind of prove to the players that his training methods are worth putting everything behind, or is it on the players to kind of have that self-motivation to make sure that they're fully behind the training methods?
Yeah, I mean, this is an argument that Conte was sort of making himself, that the players are seemingly bulletproof and don't get criticised, etc., and actually they need to have a look at themselves. I think there is some truth to that, and I think the players do have to take some responsibility for the fact that, you've seen, 4 managers get sacked in less than 4 years. That is an extraordinarily high number. I personally think that with the right head coach, you wouldn't be hearing these complaints, and that's not to say that Conte isn't a very talented, very good coach, because he is. He's done amazing things, and I'll hold my hands up. I've been very impressed with Conte at various points, and at the end of last season, I thought he'd done an amazing job, and I still think that. But I do think you need to find a way of motivating the players for a longer period of time, and I just don't think he was able to do that. It's not easy, but you look at guys like Klopp and Guardiola, and they are able to sort of regenerate and find ways of keeping the players invested. Even, look at Arteta, what he's doing over at Arsenal. So I think, yes, there are lessons for the players, and I think they do, in some respects, have to take more responsibility. But I think ultimately, if you find the right manager, and yes, at the end of Pochettino, things did go stale. He had been there 5.5 years, though, which in modern day football terms is an eternity. Without the only way you can really make that work is if you're constantly refreshing the squad, which is kind of been the City and to an extent the Liverpool model. Obviously, Spurs didn't really do that. So I don't think these are they're players that are beyond coaching, which is sort of what Conte was hinting at. I just think it's about making the right appointment, managerial appointment, which clearly is easier said than done.
Do you think it was a case of literally the whole squad turning on Conte? Because we've seen before when these kind of rumours come out, Harry Kane is usually the first one to say goodbye and thank you to the manager, as he did for Nuno, as he did for Jose Mourinho. But the silence for me is deafening at the moment, with no Spurs player whatsoever coming out on social media thanking Conte. Not even one like on his post saying goodbye to the Tottenham fans. I mean, for you, is that telling? And do you think the whole squad did turn their back on Conte?
Well, what's interesting with that is if you remember when Conte came back for the Milan second leg, which wasn't that long ago, feels like a lifetime ago.
Yeah.
But at that point, I was told that quite a lot of the players were still supportive of Conte. They were pleased to have him back. The vibes were actually quite good when he came back. Yes, there were people at that time also saying that it had been a lot better when he wasn't there, and it was a bit more relaxed, a bit less, friction with him not there and Stellini in. But there were still players who backed him when he came back. I think that all changed. That rant, the post-Southampton thing, that just burnt all his bridges. You even saw someone like Højbjerg, who was always very loyal to Conte, and generally as someone who's pretty respectful of his managers. When he was asked about it on international duty, it was pretty clear that he was pretty annoyed about it. He talked about the need for Conte to expand on what he'd said. So, I think had Southampton not happened, let's say they drew that game 0-0, Conte gave a really bland press conference and then they decided this international break to get rid of Conte, I think there would have been a lot of tributes from the players. Yes, some would have had issues with him, but I think they would have respected what he did and would have, even if some of it was just lip service and platitudes, but I still think you would have had a bunch of the players doing that. I think when he did what he did and basically torched his relationship with the players, I think for a lot of them, it was like, I'm not going to pay tribute to what you did if you're going to hang us out to dry like that in the media and in what felt, and I think, the players aren't stupid. If they felt what he was doing was to motivate them or whatever, like he sort of did against Burnley last season, but this felt far more self-serving than that. It felt, Conte basically saying to future employers, don't blame me for what's gone wrong here. This is down to the players.
Talking about, you mentioned the summer that we had spending over 150 million on new players. It was reported, I was in The Athletic a few months ago talking about the Richarlison deal. Well, I'll quote, it said, Daniel Levy was the driving force behind the signing of Richarlison after noticing Everton could have been looking at a cash in hand ahead of interested clubs. Obviously, with that, if we're saying Daniel Levy was the driving force behind that deal, we know Conte has mentioned that Spence was a club signing. He's mentioned that Danjuma is a player that has been brought in and doesn't really fit his system. It begs the question, do you think that a lot of the transfers we made, apart from obviously we know Ivan Perisic was definitely someone that Conte definitely wanted, but do we think that the transfers made in the summer were geared towards how they were good? Like, were they strategic moves geared towards how these players were going to fit into Conte's system? Or do you think the club just made signings because they saw these good players available and they thought they would be good for the club rather than actually strategic moves to fit Conte's system?
Yeah, well, that disconnect that I think exists or has existed between what Conte wants and what, let's say, the director of football, Fabio Paratici, wants, is a really big issue, because you look at the most successful recruitment operations and almost always there's alignment there between head coach, director of football, chairman. It should really be throughout the club. And, certainly City have that, but obviously they're sort of bankrolled by a nation state slightly different. But let's say a club like Arsenal, who are a pretty good comparison with Spurs, they spend a similar amount of money. They're generally in a similar place in the food chain, battling for around fourth, has tended to be where both clubs are. And that club, after years of terrible recruitment, where there wasn't this connection between head coach and director of football, now seems to really have that and has a very clear strategy. I just didn't see that at Spurs. Last season, take the left wing backs. There was a 14-year age gap between Destiny Udogie, who was more of a Paratici signing, and Ivan Perisic. Now that's fine in a way if that's a kind of agreed strategy that you're trying to secure the future and the present, but it didn't feel like that. It just felt like two competing strategies. And then you have someone like Jed Spence, who again fits more into the club signing, to use Conte's phrase. And it's just a bit of a mess, because then you're bringing in players who the head coach doesn't really want. We saw that under Jose Mourinho as well. There were players brought in that weren't really ones he particularly wanted, and then he doesn't play them much. And it's no good for anyone. So I definitely think when the club is dissecting where it went wrong with Conte, I hope that they take some of the lessons that I've just said there, or, that seem, I think, to a lot of people from outside, fairly obvious. Another big one would be, if you're going to employ a win now manager, you kind of need to sign win now players. That's how Conte, that's how Mourinho have generally been successful. So why, if you've got that kind of manager, you know what they want. They want guys like Ivan Perisic. They want people at, ideally at peak age, but if not, people who are experienced winners, in inverted commas. So, yeah, I think there was that disconnect. I think that is a big reason for why that transfer window ends up looking quite weird and a bit of a mess, when at the time it felt like quite positive, because they had spent quite a lot of money and brought quite a lot of good players in.
I don't understand that, though. Like, how can there be a disconnect between Paratici and Conte when, their visions are so much aligned? They've worked together at previous clubs. They're good friends. I mean, how does that even come about? How does their visions not align at this football club? It doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, well, I guess if you think about it, they have slightly. There's always a bit of a tension between director of football and head coach, because head coach, his job is dependent on the immediate term. So, yes, ideally they should also have a view of what's going to happen in the future, but there's a good chance they're not going to be there. So if you imagine using that left wing back example, if you're Antonio Conte, you are thinking in May, June, what's my team going to be for the first game of the season? I need it to be a team that can go. Let's say we've got a hard away game. I need someone who can go, go and slot in straight away, and we can win that game. If you're Paratici, it's probably more, well, I want to be building a team. I want to be signing players with resale value, etc., etc. So your priorities are always going to be slightly different, but you'd hope that the manager would feel that he is there also for the long term. And so he has an eye on, okay, but what about next season? What about the season after? The problem that was so obvious in this aspect is that Conte never really gave the impression he was going to be there for the long term.
Yeah.
That was very short. And so, of course, he was kind of only really thinking about tomorrow rather than next year or 2 years away. And so I think that's where the disconnect came from. And also, just generally, he is someone who, he's never been one particularly to play young players, to trust them. He'd rather go for the tried and tested. And that's why you need to think carefully about that alignment between director of football and head coach. And also, what's your overall strategy? Is it win now, or is it Tottenham DNA? Or is it somewhere in between? You need to work that out, and then
I don't
make
even
sure
think Daniel Levy knows that.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. You need to be clear on that, and then you need to make appointments that reflect it.
100%. And obviously moving on from Conte, for the last 10 games of the season, we are going to have Stellini in charge with Ryan Mason as his assistant. Do you think it's kind of a bit odd, maybe not odd, but the fact that Stellini, you would assume, obviously had a big part to play in the tactics and how we approach games throughout the season. And if the players are said to not be happy with that approach anymore, can we expect that to change for the last 10 games of the season under Stellini? Can we expect a change of a tactics or approach? And if not, then how do we expect things to improve if the players aren't happy with how we're playing?
Yeah, I think it's a really pertinent question. I mean, Stellini is the kind of continuity candidate, but it's continuity of a regime that has just imploded pretty spectacularly. I mean, I guess really broadly speaking, the logic is that results have sort of been okay, and which I know feels weird because the mood is so downbeat, but Spurs are fourth, and the period where they had their best results was with Stellini in charge. So I think the hope is that take away the toxicity and the division of sort of Conte by the end, put in someone who's a safe pair of hands, and you kind of hope that'll be enough. But I agree with you on the tactical point. I don't expect a huge amount to change, not least because Spurs basically don't really have any fit fullbacks. Like the only people they have fit are wing backs, really. They've got Porro and Perisic. Tanganga can play as a fullback, but so you'd expect that, given that they don't have any fullbacks, they can't really play four at the back. So that means a continuation of probably a 3-4-3, which a lot of fans aren't so happy with. Obviously there are different ways of playing that system, and they made this clever tactical tweak, Mason and Stellini, against Man City, where Eric Dyer stepped out of defence and basically almost man-marked Bernardo Silva. So you can make tweaks and variations even with the same system. But I do think that is going to be a fundamental question, is Conte out, and in comes a really close friend and a guy who has spent the vast majority of his coaching career working for and under Antonio Conte. And so if things start badly, both results-wise and performance-wise, I don't think it will take too long for it to turn, which maybe isn't fair on Stellini, but that is just the reality.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. But moving on to who we might be looking at as our next manager, a lot of names have been bandied about: Julian Nagelsmann, Maurizio Pochettino. But we're hearing that there could be reservations about bringing Pochettino back to the club from the hierarchy at Spurs. What do you think those reservations are?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on who who that is at the club, but Paratici, there's always a sense that Paratici and Pochettino might not be the most compatible partnership. Would Pochettino want to come and sort of be subservient to someone in that way? Paratici has other targets that he likes, someone like Luis Enrique. So it's whether the two of them would kind of want to compromise sufficiently for that to happen. I mean, anecdotally as well with Pochettino, I'd love to see it. I'd be very curious to see it as well. I think some people feel that that's in the past and they need to move in a different direction and maybe appoint someone who is a kind of equivalent of Pochettino in 2014. I mean, bear in mind, it's 9 years on from then, and Pochettino was at that point this up and coming, young, hungry coach. He's far more established and experienced now. And so it might be slightly different for him as well, whether he wants to come and, take a club that, have had a difficult few years and lift them again, or whether he wants to go somewhere a bit more established. And this is an issue that Spurs face, is that a lot of the targets that they want are aware that come the summer there might be some other jobs available as well. So they don't necessarily want to rush into anything now. They'd rather wait, see what the lay of the land is in a few months' time. So there's kind of there's a kind of bit of give and take going on, both from the club and also from their managerial targets.
Which makes sense, but obviously the main man on everyone's lips at the moment is Julian Nagelsmann. He does seem to be a lot of people reporting he's Tottenham's number one target. There are people who are saying they do have a few reservations about him, just about how things ended at Bayern and how things went overall with him. But for you, what's your opinion about how he would fit into this the Tottenham structure and whether he would be a good fit for Tottenham?
Yeah, I mean, he's clearly a very talented, experienced, successful coach who I think would have a lot of interesting ideas tactically. He's obviously still very young. There are a few things. I mean, one is that you'd have to be really sure that he really wanted the job, because I think the last thing that Spurs should do is go for another manager who sees the club as a bit beneath him, which felt like it was the case with Conte from pretty early on. So is this someone who really wants to be there? Is he really hungry? Is he invested in it for the long term? Does he want to be there for a few years and really build something? I think you'd also want to be careful about the reports that came out that he wasn't close with a lot of the players, that there was some friction between him and people at board level. These are all things that we've seen from Spurs head coaches, and the club really want to avoid repeating. So those would be the reservations. But clearly, take those things away, and you've got a very, very impressive young guy and a very, very good manager. Again, he fits into that category of, well, first of all, he's just been sacked. So it stands to reason, I can understand why he'd want a bit of time to decompress and work out what he wants to do next. And also come the summer, Real Madrid may be looking for a manager, PSG, there are some big clubs, some of the big Italian clubs as well. So he may well have some other options. So yeah, we'll have to see. But I can definitely see why he's admired by a lot of people at Spurs. And bear in mind, they wanted him in 2019, they wanted him in 2021. That said, it was kind of also the case with Conte and Mourinho that they wanted him previously and then finally got him. So maybe that isn't the best precedent. But I think were they to get him, it would definitely feel like a coup.
We're coming up to a difficult time with Harry Kane once again, obviously in the summer with 1 year left in his contract. Cast your mind back to 2 years ago when he did that interview with Gary Neville, and then we saw a very poor first half of the season from Harry Kane. I mean, what can we do to maybe avoid that situation again?
Yeah, that's a really difficult one. I mean, the thing that Spurs really could have done is win something and look like they were making serious progress. I mean, bear in mind, Kane's position has always been pretty clear that he wants to end his career winning the kind of trophies that he feels are commensurate with his talent and all of that. And I think that's completely fair enough. And that his dream, first and foremost, would be to do that with Spurs. Once he felt that wasn't possible, which was how he felt 2 years ago, he felt he needed to move. And what Spurs need to do to keep him is not let him get to that point again. The worry is that Spurs don't really feel much closer to winning trophies. It could be they don't even get top 4. And so Harry Kane could be thinking, I'm about to turn 30. I'm going to be playing in the Europa League or Europa Conference League next season. I want out. So the best thing they can do from here on in is finish the season strongly, get in the Champions League, and, really make the case to Kane, we're bringing in manager X, who's going to be fantastic for you. We're going to sign player Y, who we think will complement you, really show that ambition, because I think if they don't do that, then he would be well within his rights to start thinking about a move again. And obviously he's got even more leverage this time. Last time around, he had 3 years left on his contract. So ultimately it was out of his hands. This time he's only got 1 year. And so that would put Spurs in a position where they're deciding, well, do we cash in now, or do we just say Harry Kane's so good that we'd rather lose him for free but get another year from him? Neither of which would be ideal options. But I do fear that obviously that the longer that goes unresolved, and I don't think anything's going to happen imminently, there's no reason why Kane wouldn't wait until the end of the season. Bear in mind, the longer time goes on, the more leverage he has. But yeah, that all you can say, finish season strongly with these last 10 games and be in as good a position as possible to make the case to Kane that he can achieve what he wants to achieve at Spurs.
Do you reckon there could be a slight conflict in terms of getting a manager with the gravitas to try and keep Kane compared to getting a manager who's actually the right fit for the club in terms of to bring the club forward? And there could be a slight conflict there because maybe the right manager to convince Kane that he can win trophies in the short term might not be the best manager for Tottenham in the long term.
I think that's a really interesting point, and that's something that has slightly underpinned, I think, to a certain extent, the win now appointments, because there is a logic in a way in going for a Mourinho Conte if you think that they've got a generational talent in Harry Kane, arguably 2 in Son Heung-min. Those are probably 2, if not the best 2, but certainly 2 of the best Premier League players Spurs have ever had. And so you can see the logic in saying these guys are in their late 20s, obviously Son's 30 now. We just need to max out on their talents because they're not going to be around forever. We need to just get someone who can get us over the line. And I do think that has been a consideration, and I can see the logic in it. But yeah, then again, does how much of a factor is that this summer? Because yeah, it might be the case that if Spurs do bring in someone who's not such a big name and is a builder for the future, that could be less appealing for Kane. I mean, and bear in mind, he really enjoyed working with Conte and got a lot out of him. He enjoyed working with Mourinho as well. So yeah, I think that is a really salient point, and that's going to be something that's going to be one of many factors they have to weigh up when choosing who to go for this summer. And again, it comes down to the long term versus the short term, and it's not easy.
And finally, we're going to finish on this. There was an article yesterday, I think it was from Matt Law, talking about a potential hike in season ticket prices from the club for next season. I was just wondering if you've heard anything along those lines and if we should be expecting a serious hike, seeing as what we've been through the last couple of years as Spurs fans.
No, I haven't heard anything directly on that. But Matt's very good, and I'm sure that'll be very well sourced. But as he says in the piece, there's nothing's been confirmed on that. So I guess it's a slight wait and see. And other clubs have been increasing prices and that sort of thing. But yeah, I think just fingers crossed that it doesn't come to that. Because as you say, there's already some disgruntlement amongst the fan base, and I don't think that would go down particularly well.
Absolutely. But Charlie, thank you so much for giving up your time coming on the channel. Some really great Tottenham insight. Just thank you for coming on.
Thank you. Cheers, guys.
Cheers, mate.
Nice one, Charlie.
So that was Charlie Eccleshare. Some really good insight there.
Yeah, 100%. And so I think some really good points about where the future of the club is heading. Obviously, it was really good to hear what he had, the insight in terms of the time under Conte, what actually, what really happened. And I think that it kind of is a bit of an eye opener as to how the players really fell out with Antonio Conte. And how that tenure all blew up. But obviously, when it comes to the future, it's just so open, isn't it? At the moment, with 10 games to go, I think a lot of it is just dependent on how we do finish the season. What happens with Fabio Paratici as well? It's all so open, so it's hard to really predict what's going to happen with Tottenham future, and even like people like Harry Kane, what's going to happen with him. It's hard to put your finger on what is going to happen until we know how the season is going to end and all that kind of stuff. So it's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out with Tottenham. It's a very uncertain time, just like it was 2 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, when you're looking at it, we sacked Pochettino, right, 2019. And the future has just got more uncertain and more uncertain as the years have gone on. And now it's all coming to a head now with Harry Kane, and to see where we go. So I think that it was really good insight from Charlie Eccleshare there. We'll get stuff clipped up for you and put them on various social media platforms. But I hope you guys enjoyed it. And if you want us to get anyone else on, then do put them in their names in the chat, and we'll do our best to deliver that for you. But I think that is all we have today. So thank you everyone for joining. Like, subscribe and comment. And as always,
come on you Spurs.